All right, we are live. Hello, Tony Overbay.
Josh Edlow. I am excited to be on the Edlow podcast.
I'm excited for you and me. So, Tony is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a certified mindful habit coach. He's a motivational speaker. He's often asked to speak at various events, schools, churches, formal settings, training events. One of the questions that was actually asked, because every so often when I have a new guest coming on, I kind of give a snapshot of who it is, and I ask people if they have anonymous questions they want to ask. Go ahead and do so. And one of the questions that was asked is why did you choose to do the coaching and be a marriage and family therapist?
Okay, this is honestly a wonderful question because as a therapist, I feel like a lot of times therapists turn their nose up to life coaches, and life coaches say, hey, a life coach will tell you how to get things done, and a therapist will just tell me more about that. So I feel like there's a little bit of an adversarial relationship at times. But when I started my pornography recovery program, I actually licensed part of it from a guy who is pretty well known in that space. And so in part of the licensing, then you become certified as this mindful habit coach. And then that was a few years ago. And then enter worldwide pandemic. And now all of a sudden people are doing virtual therapy. And technically I can't do therapy outside of the state of California. So you have to do coaching if you're going across state lines. So now all of a sudden having a coaching certification was wonderful because now I could do virtual therapy across state lines. And now all of a sudden I'm a life coach. So the very life coaches that I used to lovingly make fun of, now I too am one. And sometimes I like to say I've got a alter ego, Toby, the life coach, that tells you just get it done and knock it off. And then Tony, the therapist, comes in and says, tell me more about that. What's that like for you?
So. Well, that's interesting because one of the things I wanted to say, I've dealt with a few different people now who are therapists. And one of the things that I found very interesting about you, I listened to your podcast. We've spoken in the past. And I've noticed that other therapists, other coaches, things like that, you talk to them and they're very validating and they're very nice.
Yeah.
But I think but then they're kind of like looking at you going, okay, so like, what do you do next? Right. And I go, I thought, and I'd be like, I thought that's why I come to see you. And and so, but the difference is that, when in dealing with you and talking with you and kind of being coached a little bit by you, over the course of time, I've noticed the difference is that coming away from your coaching has been, it's not only validating, but you give concrete tools.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting because I don't know if that comes from just a very healthy ego that you have versus some of the other people. And especially when it comes to especially in my experience, I'm not a life coach or a therapist at all, but I have a lot of friends that will call me specifically when they're dealing with faith crises. And or also I've had a lot of friends call me when they're struggling in their marriages. And I don't know, I did not bring this on myself, but I know that there's a sense out there of a lot of people are really hesitant to give people concrete advice situations.
Yeah.
But you don't seem to have that problem.
Well, and I love what you said earlier about, is it healthy ego? And I feel like, and we'll talk about that because I think that's a fascinating concept. So I think there's healthy ego, but also, and I would imagine, I love this part about what I do and I would imagine you as an attorney, that there are just things that you've seen so many times that this is what this person is experiencing and this is what the future looks like for that person. And I feel like it takes a lot of reps in a chair of doing something you love until you realize that, okay, I'm seeing some pretty consistent patterns. And so with the areas I work with, I mean, primarily couples therapy, sometimes one of the people may have a personality disorder or is incredibly emotionally immature, that it is such a consistent pattern. And I've seen, I think, about 12 or 1,300 couples now over 15, 16, 17 years of being a couples therapist. So you do see just solid, consistent patterns of people that come in just not knowing what they don't know, and you hand them a tool and all of a sudden, it's bumpy to use the new tool to communicate, but now their lives have changed. And then there's this other percentage of people where they can't play in the sandbox, that, with that tool, it doesn't matter because their situation is so unique that forget your tools, old man, let me tell you how bad he is or she is. And so I feel like over time you see enough of that it does become very predictable. And then you are able to feel pretty confident about what you're seeing over and over again. And so I think that it's both the healthy ego and then time in the chair. But really quick too, I feel like the therapy part, as a therapist, we often, you think you want to give people homework, but if you've been doing it for a long time, there's some decent data out there that says people are pretty much not going to do homework. And then they're going to come back and then feel like, what's wrong with me? And then eventually they're going to think that the therapist is judging me and I'm going to stop coming to therapy. And so, so as a therapist, I feel like you almost over time default to, man, this is a long process and tell me about that and how are you feeling? And a life coach often just gets in there and says, this is how you do it. And so I really do love now understanding a little bit more about coaching. So I feel like I can say, I'm pretty confident that this is what would help. But then I'm also ready to help you if that is difficult or if that isn't what your experience is. So I do feel like I got a little bit of that combination there that can help.
So that's interesting. And I do want to talk, you mentioned something about narcissism, dealing with someone or not really narcissism. I know you focus on narcissism as a major personality disorder that you work with, but you also said either deals with personality disorder or extreme emotional maturity.
Yeah,
Yeah. And we're definitely going to talk about that. But before we go into that specifically, I want to get a little bit more information about you. One of the things that's really interesting about you, I have a couple friends that are a couple that came to you and in their couples therapy and then saw you individually and one of the people in the couple were like, you really got to listen to this guy's podcast. I really think you'll enjoy what you're hearing. And I didn't listen very much and all that. I was like, yeah, I'm sure I'll get to it. I got so much stuff going on. But then I had one thing that drew me to your podcast and to getting to know more about you was another friend of mine mentioned that this is a second career for you.
Yeah.
So why, what were you doing before?
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is kind of fun to talk about because talk about not knowing what I didn't know. So I got out of college and I went into the computer industry and I'm almost 53. So, I mean, this was a long time ago and I spent a decade in the computer industry and all the way through the .com boom, I thought we were going to be rich. I worked for a small software company that got larger. And I just thought this is just what you do. You go to work and you don't really like it very much. And then you make it through the day and you travel some and you have fun. And when you can, but you're really living for the evenings and the weekends and those sort of things. And so I just felt like this is my lot in life. This is just settle in and then you don't enjoy your job. But I really did. I have to be dramatic and say I've always felt a little bit of a call to help. I wanted to help guys become better husbands and fathers. And then there was a combination going on. So I'm in the software industry and I did travel a lot and I got to speak a lot, but I was actually speaking about things that I really didn't know about. So I felt like I was memorizing scripts. We were, if any of your listeners are computer nerds, we built device drivers. I mean, that is about as boring as you can get. And I would have to speak about it and try to make it really exciting. So I would throw t-shirts out and I would be funny. And then I would show that our device driver accessed data milliseconds faster than our competitors. And I even thought that must be cool because we get pretty excited about it at our office, but it wasn't really anything that spoke to me. But meanwhile, I'm there, and as we're setting up our trade show booths and I'm talking to the laborers and I'm finding, guys are telling me about kind of like what you're talking about, where people are coming to me with their marriages and talking about their struggles and challenges. And I ate that up and I loved every documentary in the world about, people, biographies. I just loved that whole concept of people. And so then I felt like I want to help husbands become better or men become better husbands and fathers. And then it all just kind of culminated in, I wrote a humor column in a newspaper for 10 years. And then my wife started having kids. We started having children. And I started writing what I thought was pretty hilarious things in this newspaper column. And then I thought, you know what, I think I want to turn this into a book. And I like to think that then I said, well, nobody's going to buy the book unless I have these letters behind my name. And I think, honestly, I was using that as an excuse to then go back to school and get my master's in counseling. And nice. So in my early 30s, I went back and got my master's in counseling. And I always thought, I maybe will see some clients, but really it's about this book that I actually never wrote. So it was about seeing the clients. And then I did part-time therapy for my church for 6 or 7 years. And then the more I got into it, the more I found my lane, and this is amazing. And then I worked into private practice. And so, yeah, that first career was in the computer software industry. And I just didn't really even know how much I could like something until I got out of that career.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. And that's actually a really great, I think that's motivational for a lot of people who are listening, because I know there's a lot of people, like, I'm really blessed that I love being an attorney.
Yeah.
So I enjoy it. I'm fulfilled by it, but I know there's a lot of people out there that they go to work, they clock out.
Yeah.
And, they're not having fun for a third of their day or more.
Yeah.
And that's just not a real great way to live.
It's not, and it's funny because there's a cliche and where it's if you do what you love, then it will turn into a job, and I would hear people say that in my office, and it was only a few years ago where all of a sudden I thought, oh, wait a minute, I love what I do, and it is my job, and I still love it. So I almost felt like that's something that we tell ourselves so that we, in this fear of that, well, I don't want to really go after this thing that I think is amazing. Because maybe what if it doesn't work out, or, so I'm going to continue to do the thing that I don't really like so that I can live to do the thing that I like. But then I honestly feel like by the time people hit their evenings and weekends, and I talk about this on some of my podcast episodes, this concept of emotional calories. I mean, how many emotional calories are spent during the day when you don't like what you're doing? And so to the point where when you get to the evening and then it's like, you know what, I'm exhausted now, but man, this weekend I'll kill it. But then the weekend hits and now I kind of need to recuperate. But next weekend I'm on it. And then before you know it, how many years are down the road? And now it's midlife crisis time, and you got to get your convertible and your hair plugs and your chains and the whole thing.
I hear you. So, what specifically? It sounds like you mentioned the first 5 or 6 years you're working for the church. Is that what kind of drew you? You have two main issues that you deal with: personality disorders, and it seems like specifically narcissism. Narcissistic personality disorder seems to be a big one for you. I know you have a podcast, Waking Up to Narcissism, which is fantastic.
You're very kind.
And then also faith crisis.
Yes.
So did you start with the faith crisis?
This is what I think is funny. Little did I know that new guy shows up as an intern for the church, and then they say, hey, we're going to hand you pornography addiction and faith crisis. And I thought, oh, okay. I didn't know what I didn't know.
Fun ones.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so then, and so it was kind of pitched to me as well as, and there's a chance you might have your own faith crisis or faith journey. And I thought, hey, okay, no problem. And then the pornography addiction, or turning to pornography, as an unhealthy coping mechanism, which is more of a mouthful. And that's kind of where I go with that now. So yeah, those were the two things that I was really working on. And I have to tell you, it was the faith journey stuff, faith crisis, wasn't as prevalent. So even though I was working for the church and I was working with that, and I would go to trainings and read things, that was a pretty small percentage, because this was, over 15 years ago, and I don't think that was as prevalent. But when I'm working with the pornography or any unhealthy coping mechanism, we were still kind of working off of this vibe of, well, hey, just change your thought, or sing a hymn, or do some push-ups. And I'm finding that isn't really working, these behavioral techniques. And so I actually called what I started identifying were these, what I call voids in a person's life. And it was primarily guys I was working with. And I would say, okay, if they didn't feel connected in their marriage, their parenting, their faith, their health, or their career, then they turn to these unhealthy coping mechanisms. So then I felt like, all right, I'm on to something, but now I actually have to find a way to address those issues. So, I doubled down on this couples method called emotionally focused therapy, which has led to my 4 pillars of a connected conversation, which I think are just manna from heaven. It's a way to communicate. And then parenting, I found this nurtured heart parenting technique, which I love, and changed my whole world with my own kids. And then, I really embrace this concept in therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, which is beautiful. And I think that addresses what people really want to do, their career, and maybe even some of their health issues. And then that left the faith journey stuff. And I was more into that camp of almost like apologetics, where we can make sense of some things that don't make a lot of sense. And then that didn't really feel right. And that took me on a journey until I really found Fowler's Stages of Faith. And then, and that just spoke to me so much. And now I think it's interesting. It went from maybe a person once every week or so that I'm dealing with somebody who's struggling with their faith, to now, it's literally every day, 2 or 3 sessions at least, where that's coming into the room, whether it's in a couple's environment or individual. So it all started off as trying to help people turn away from unhealthy coping mechanisms. But meanwhile, I found ways to address all of these voids, and that one of helping people with their faith, that one just became a passion. And since then, I think we've talked before, but I trained 300 and something therapists for the church on how to navigate a faith journey, faith crisis, and I've done a lot of firesides on that. And I really love talking about that. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you bring that up because I've noticed when I speak with people who are struggling in their faith, not always, but a lot of the time, and I know you were talking about pornography, but even in a faith crisis, I find sometimes it seems to kind of coincide with some life event. Like I mentioned earlier that I deal with a lot of people. They'll call me when they're struggling in their marriages, and it seems like that's almost like the same thing, almost like almost like because things aren't working out the way that they'd hoped because of the checklist they got from the church. And you and I are both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're very regimented in kind of from age 12 to about 30, your whole life is pretty much checklisted for you. And when you get to the end of that checklist and things aren't great, you're kind of stuck in this spot where you're like, well, I got to reassess everything. Is that what you're seeing too?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I like the way you lay that out, and you can stop me at any time, Josh, because I could do the next hour on this alone. But I really do feel like though, people, and are you familiar with Fowler stages of faith?
Not exactly. I think I've heard of them before. I know that a friend of mine who also works with you actually provided me some information on that. Why don't you give us a little?
Is that okay? Because I think this makes again, here I'm about to say, we're trying to make sense of things that don't make sense. And then I was about to say, but this makes sense. So I realize I'm about to contradict myself. But so James Fowler, I should know this because I've spoken about it so often, but he was a minister, but he also worked in the psychology department of, I cannot remember the name of the college. And he did a pretty lengthy study over a few years of people that were in essence, all encompassing belief systems. So high demand religion, orthodox religions. And so he laid out these 6 stages of faith that coincide with some cool psychology of Erickson's and Piaget's stages of life. And so the first one, he talks about stage 1, which he calls it intuitive and projective faith. And this is the stage where preschool children, so it's like 0 to 3 years old, and where fantasy and reality get mixed together. But projective faith, as I say, this is where kids are playing on the ground with their toys, and their parents say, hey, kids, there's a God. And they just keep playing with their toys. And so then stage 2 is called mythic and literal. And this is like 3 to 12. And this is the stage where when kids become more school age, they start to understand the world in very literal ways. And they generally accept the stories that are told to them by their faith community or by their parents, but they understand them in really literal ways. So, and this one I talk about here, we're looking at the Easter Bunny, the Tooth Fairy, Batman, Jesus. I mean, they're all mythic and literal. So they're very big. And so that mythic and literal stage is and Fowler talks about how some people could stay in that. And I think of maybe, Lenny from Of Mice and Men. I haven't really run into a lot of people that kind of stay in stage 2. But stage 3 are right when things get real. And stage 3 is called it's synthetic and conventional. So conventional faith, stage 3 is, I'm going to introduce the concept of a box, not in a judgmental way, but everything fits neat and orderly in a box from cradle to grave, or pre-existence to the eternities. This is where all those checklist items come into play. And so most people move on to this stage as teenagers. And that's when, at this point, their life has grown to include a lot of different social circles. And so there's this inherent need to kind of put things together or to make sense. And so usually they adopt some sort of all-encompassing belief system. And at this point, people tend to have a hard time seeing outside of their box. And they often don't even realize that they are in a box, because this is just the air that they breathe. And then, then authority is usually placed in groups or individuals that represent one's beliefs. So, a priest, a rabbi, a bishop, that sort of thing. And this is the stage where most people will remain. So then I like to say, all right, now you're in that box and things make sense, but now life starts to happen. So this is where there might be addictions or betrayal or death of a spouse, or somebody might come out as gay, or there's so many different things that happen that all of a sudden you don't necessarily fit nice and clean in this box. And then when you're looking for help within the stage 3 box, and there's a stage 3 leader, then the answer is most always just pray and read your scriptures. And I think most people have heard that over and over. And when people are really starting to feel less than, or something's wrong with them, it's not like they haven't tried. They've tried the pray and read your scriptures for years, if not longer. Right. And so
let me stop you right there.
I
want to share something about that, because I think this all makes a lot of sense to me. But like, I think a lot of people, especially in the Mormon church, for lack of a better term, have at some point or another gone through some form of faith crisis. And I went through one too, and it actually did coincide with a pretty big, significant life event, that was going on. The checklist wasn't making a lot of sense for me. But what I was really surprised about, and this kind of goes to a question that someone asked, the question was, how do you believe members of a faith community should help someone dealing with faith crisis? But I was surprised that when I shared, even with like my closest friends who I felt like knew me really well, when I was sharing that I was going through a faith crisis, and I don't know, it wasn't even really like, it wasn't like I was going to leave the church, but I was just kind of like, man, this doesn't make a lot of sense. There was almost a sense of a lot of people that, Josh, is there something you're not telling us that you're not doing right? Is there something that you're doing that's like, that doesn't make sense? If you're doing everything right, you shouldn't feel this way. Something's off, right? And I'm like going, look, I am in the bishopric. I'm paying my tithe. Like, I'm like defending myself to all these people, going like, there is nothing. I am not only a good member of the church, I'm one of the best members of the church that I know. You know what I mean? Like, I'm 100% home teaching. Nobody does that, and so it's really, I found that so interesting how there's a sense, and maybe this is that stage 3 in the box thing. Like, it seems like if you're in that stage, you can't square that someone wouldn't be able to do all these things and it not quite work out.
Okay, Josh, this is what I love about this is this stuff continues to evolve, and I feel like I've put a few more pieces together since the last time I've maybe done my own episode or been interviewed about this. So exclusive for Edlow Podcast listeners here. We're going to make even more sense of things, right? Because what you said is so good. I did an episode a couple of weeks ago on my Virtual Couch podcast about a concept called, there's a guy named Marshall Rosenberg, and he talks about nonviolent communication. And I have had that recommended to me before, but there's just something, I don't know, paradoxical about violence and communication that I haven't even looked into it. So then I had somebody close to me share a little bit of this. And then I thought, well, I like that person, so I'm going to dig in deeper. And it was mind blowing. And I've got a note up here that this Marshall Rosenberg said that, it sounds like an oxymoron, nonviolent communication. But this Marshall Rosenberg says most people's default manner of speaking to others is highly violent. That is, if you consider violence to include attempts at cutting others down to size or coercing them into doing what we want. And now that sounds like, a very heavy topic, but when people are saying you must be doing something wrong if you're having that faith crisis, in essence, what that person's saying is, oh, that gives me anxiety, so I need you to help me with my anxiety. So I have to make sense of what you're doing to make me feel better. And one of the things that Marshall Rosenberg talks about is one of the first lessons learned in nonviolent communication is separating observation from judgment. And so the observation is person is struggling with faith. And now we come in with a judgment and say, well, it must be because he's doing something wrong. Because, okay, that makes sense to me. Because if I now separate observation from judgment, now I have to lean in with some curiosity, and there's a chance that I might get invalidated. My experience might be invalidated because this person's having a completely different experience. And so if heaven forbid, if they're going through a faith crisis or a faith journey and they actually are okay, then what does that say about me? So it's so hard because we continually look through things from our own lens. I mean, that is our hardwired default setting. So right. So I just think that's so fascinating. So when somebody says, well, you must be doing this in this concept of observation from judgment, there's so many examples of this where, my son didn't finish his homework because he must be lazy, instead of the observation, he didn't finish his homework. Now I got to come in with the judgment of he must be lazy because I would hate for it to be that I didn't hold boundaries of having him do homework, or I'm not good at math. And so maybe in his DNA is, he can't do math. Or so we throw that judgment in there really quickly to ease our own anxiety. And so I just think that, right, that's so interesting. So in that stage 3, and I love what you're saying, because it really is, people typically have to go through something to then even look at challenge in their faith. But here's where I think things get really interesting is then when people, and the reason I like that Fowler talks about the box is, if I have banged around the box for so long, eventually I'm going to say, what is wrong with me? And that's where now I come in with my therapy of this acceptance and commitment therapy model of, oh, nothing. I mean, you're the only version of you that's ever walked the face of the earth, with your nature, nurture, birth order, DNA, abandonment, rejection, all that. So you feel, think, and behave the way you do because you're a human being going through life for the very first time. So nothing's wrong with you. But then at some point, then what it feels like to be you in that box doesn't feel very good. So people then exit and they go into stage 4. And here's where things get really interesting. Stage 4, intuitive and reflective, and are individuative and reflective. And this is a tough stage, often begun in young adulthood, where people start seeing outside of their box and realize that there are other boxes, and they begin to critically examine their own faith or their own faith community. And they often become disillusioned with their faith because they've been trying, and the people in their box have been telling them, just do this, just, you must be sinning, just pray and read your scriptures more. And so the hard part is that they become disenchanted often with their faith. And then the stage 3 people then are assuming that now the stage 4 people have become backsliders. So they say, well, okay, well, don't read those things, or don't think those things, or just do these other. So nobody is listening to anybody. Stage 3 and stage 4, there's a tremendous amount of this stuff called the psychological reactance, or the instant negative reaction of being told what to do. So when somebody says, you just need to, our brains are wired to say, I will not, just like right now, right? Don't think of a white polar bear, don't think of a blue car. I mean, our brain's like, I will think of the white polar bear. Matter of fact, he'll be in the blue car, so forget you, right? So when people in stage 3 are saying, don't do this, people in stage 4 are saying, I'll do even more of that. And so, and what I think is interesting is, so I'll never get somebody in my office in stage 3 having a faith journey, faith crisis, because they're just doing and being, and everything fits in that box. But I'll get the person in stage 4, and one of the first things they'll do is say, don't you dare tell me just to read my scriptures and pray, because that's what I've been trying to do. But then I also think there's an interesting thing, Joshua, where people will say, and this is what I love about this work, is that they'll say, so often they'll say, man, I don't even want to tell you the things I know, or that I've been reading, and I say this all the time. I just say, please do, because I've been doing this for so long. I've heard everything. Tell me something new. Like, I just want to hear a new. And I don't know. Have you heard of this? I'll be like, oh man, yeah. This part of this, and oftentimes I feel like that's where somebody says, well, why aren't you angry? Why aren't you disenchanted? And then that's where it's like, oh, welcome to stage 5. So stage 5 of faith is it's called conjunctive faith. And Fowler said it's rare for people to reach this stage before midlife. And this is the point where people begin to realize the limits of logic, and they start to accept paradoxes in life. And so they begin to see life as more of a mystery. And so they can return to their faith community, but without feeling stuck inside a theological box. And so stage 5 becomes this place of, you know what, I've been there in stage 3, and I'm grateful for when it worked. And then I've also been through that stage 4 battle, and I did not feel good. I felt distance from my community, my people, and I didn't like that. And so stage 5, and it's not like you just settle in there. I always say people then start hopping around from 3 to 5, 3 to 5, a little bit of 4, 4 to 3, 3 to 5, until you settle into 5. And then and now I can again accept paradoxes. And the irony is that stage 5 does become a little bit more of I know that this phrase gets used in a negative light, but a little bit more buffet style, a little bit more, hey, I can still feel a connection to my faith community, because I don't go all or nothing, and like people do in stage 4, and throw out all my experiences. And that's why Fowler says it's hard to reach that stage before midlife, because typically people have had a fair amount of good experience in the box, in the stage 3 faith. And so then in stage 4, that psychological reactance is so strong that our brain is wired to do all or nothing, black or white thinking, these cognitive distortions. So then it makes sense oftentimes that we're almost saying, yeah, just tell me to do this again so I can leave, when in reality, it goes back to that question when you were saying earlier, when somebody's going through a faith journey, faith crisis, the best thing that somebody can do is to say, tell me more. What is that like? Help me understand.
And that's the thing that I think I observed when I was going through mine was it almost that, especially in our church, it seems as though the natural reaction is to defend at all costs,
Absolutely.
even indefensible positions.
Yes.
You know,
Oh, well said.
and me as an attorney, I just have this knack to where I got to depose people when they do that. So I'm going like, okay, so you're telling me this quote by this prophet, you agree with that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's something you agree with. And they'll go, no, I don't agree with that. Of course not. I'm like, okay, so then it can't be good. Right. You know what I mean? And but I think that it's interesting what you said, bouncing back and forth. And this is something that it's taken me a long time, because I think that in my situation, with my faith crisis, it was not doctrinal. It was more, it was more of a
cultural.
I don't understand why this is happening to me. Situational, like I'm doing all the things. Why is this happening to me? And it took me. You mentioned those paradoxes where things don't fit in the box, and I just kind of always felt, we all got this checklist in the 90s of like, if you do these things and endure to the end, you will have joy. Yeah. And then you're sitting there and you're like, well, why do I not have joy? And why did this terrible thing happen that has really affected me? That's not fair. That's not right. And it took me a long time to kind of realize that there really isn't always a connection. Like, it's kind of like, I was just thinking about this yesterday. Faith is not about changing the will of God, right? And your faith can't change another person's free agency. So sometimes bad things just happen.
Yeah.
And there's just nothing you can do.
Yeah.
And it took me a while to kind of accept that, you could be doing all the right things and something bad, no fault of your own. It has nothing to do with your faithfulness or your obedience to gospel principles or anything like that. Sometimes things are just going to happen, and it's not fair and it's not right. And that's when the faith is the most important.
It is. It's funny, Josh. And again, exclusive Edlow Podcast, exclusive number 2 now. I mean, I never, when I was in my stage 3 days, boy, if somebody said, the gospel according to Tony, and I would say, oh my gosh, that this guy, I can't even hear what he's about to say. But I really do feel like that agency. I swear to you, it has to be down to the molecular level, the biological level, because the joke that I like to make often is my parents, get together and they're, I have a history of some alcohol issues in my family of origin. And so then if you put a couple of people together and they have a kid, we're getting to learn more and more about I've got some stunted neurotransmitters. So now welcome to the world of ADHD, so now as an adult card carrying member of the ADHD club, and now I'm dopamine deficient. So I'm a bit more impulsive. And then, and that has led to maybe even more of this anxious attachment style. So the way I show up in my relationships, it was literally, in my DNA. And so then, I feel like, is that then the fault of myself, or did my parents, did they struggle with unhealthy coping mechanisms because of the way that their parents modeled behavior to them? And so at some point, things are happening. And so that's where I feel like I go all day long on the concept of the atonement, that hey, we're just trying our best. And everybody has all their own challenges and struggles. But I mean, I feel like at some point there are just things happening, and then maybe it isn't necessarily that God had needed that happen for a reason, but more of that happened. And now God is with us. So now what do we do about that?
It's interesting that you bring that up. I've often said, I'm like, I can't wait to the day when everything gets revealed, because I think it's way more intricate and complicated than anybody even thinks. So interesting. Well, that's interesting. So that you go through those 5 faiths. Is there a 6th?
There is. Yeah, it's universalizing faith. It says few people reach this stage, those who do live their lives in full service of others without worry or doubts. And they say, that's Jesus, Buddha, Gandhi, Mother Teresa. So my joke is I will never hit stage 6 because I still get ticked off.
Right. Yeah. Wow, that's interesting.
Well, and I'll tell you real quick too, before we get off of that, what I think is interesting is, and I can sound very dramatic, but there was a historian, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but he often talked about that what happens is, so a religion occurs because there was an orthodox belief, and now all of a sudden here comes an unorthodox belief. So whether it was Christ, to pre-Christian religion, or then whether it's Joseph Smith and the world of Mormonism, or then now there's this unorthodox belief that happens. And now you go a mere, I think this person said 150 to 300 years into the future. And now all of a sudden, in essence, every faith has almost a stage 3 versus stage 5 battle. So we're going, almost progressive versus orthodox. So if stage 3 air quotes wins, then we may have Amish, where we now double down on we have no electricity, or Hasidic Jews, and we're going to be having side curls. And if stage 5 in essence wins, then take a look at something like the Catholic Church, where you can have Orthodox with non-Orthodox, and they can take the sacrament right beside each other. And one of them says, this is just, transfigured into the flesh and blood of Christ in my mouth. And the other person says, this is a stale cracker and some warm grape juice, but we are both Catholic, And so there's a kind of a belief at times that it's almost like, where do we go? Who wins, orthodoxy or, hey, this is just my people and my tribe.
Right. Wow. That's really interesting. That's interesting. So I wanted to shift gears a little bit to your other area of expertise, which is personality disorder and narcissism. And I'll start, first of all, real quick. What is it that drew you to a focus on narcissism?
So this is okay. So when I kind of was telling you the story about working with a lot of couples, that it really was, at the time, initially, I would say 75-80% of the couples I would work with would get new tools. And then couples work actually became really enjoyable. And I would never want to be a couples therapist when you have a real framework, and my 4 pillars of this connected conversation are an evidence-based framework built on this model called emotionally focused therapy. And it's amazing. But then there would just continually be people that could not use the framework to have productive, emotionally mature conversations. And the more you started looking at the consistency of the people that couldn't show up in a conversation, then you start seeing there's a lot of emotional immaturity or narcissistic traits and tendencies. And to be honest with you, Josh, and I say this on my podcast, but I started thinking, oh my gosh, I have these. I mean, these narcissistic traits and tendencies, I'm living them. And so that was a big aha moment. And then I felt like the more I shared that on my podcasts, the more that I felt like it was easier to have people bring up their own narcissistic traits or tendencies in my office. And then it made it easier to deal with. And so then we were able to start even moving the needle on some of the most complex of cases, in a sense.
Right. You know what I think is really interesting is that you draw a pretty good distinction between, because I think a lot of these terms, more and more people are going to therapy now, right? And a lot of these terms like narcissism, gaslighting, they're kind of interchangeable and thrown away all the time.
They are.
Perhaps you could explain quickly the difference between narcissism and emotional immaturity.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting. I had a guest on my podcast, and she's my all-time most downloads, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson Fife. And we did this one where we were talking about anxious and avoidant attachment and couples relationships. And then we had a mutual fan who had emailed me and asked a question about narcissism. And I was ready to show off and say, here's all the things I know about narcissism. And Dr. Fife just said, well, we're all a little bit narcissistic. And I thought, oh, how dare you? Like, that's not the answer. I'm about to go on a roll. And then I remember just thinking about that. And then the more I started digging into, again, my own emotional immaturity or narcissistic traits and tendencies, that kind of led to this concept of narcissistic personality disorder as a diagnosis is maybe 2 to 3% of the population. But man, we are all emotionally immature in certain areas until we're not, until we then are able to kind of do our own work. And that work is difficult because you have to step outside of your ego. You have to really understand and have empathy and where somebody else is coming from. And let me even step back there a second. There's a lady named Eleanor Greenberg that writes a lot about narcissism. And I refer to this, what she says often, where she just says, narcissistic personality disorder is the name for a series of coping strategies that began as an adaptation to a childhood family situation that leaves a person with unstable self-esteem, the inability to regulate their self-esteem without external validation, and lower empathy. And so, when you kind of start from that place, this is where I do often say that every kid, oh, go ahead.
No, I would go, keep going.
So I would say, so every kid by nature, by definition, is a little egotistical narcissist, because the world does revolve around them. And they don't have understanding of what others are going through. So the simple example is that if a kid says, I want a pony for my birthday, and you live in an apartment complex, and they don't care, they've asked for a pony. So if
Right.
you don't give them that pony, then you hate them. You must not love them. And that must also mean that there's something wrong with them, that they
Sure.
are broken or unlovable. And so oftentimes when people grow up in these emotionally homes where there's emotional immaturity, so parents haven't taken ownership of things. You know, a parent can never say my bad or that's my fault, or a parent is the one that continually models this. Don't you understand what I'm going through to the kids, or don't start with me, or again, this their own emotional immaturity, the inability to sit with uncomfortable emotion and or to feel like there could be anything wrong with them. So when kids grow up and they have that modeled, then now they're taking that into their adolescence and into their adulthood, where they never moved out of that emotional immature kid who they are the center of the universe. And so if you don't validate them, then that means you don't like them and there's something wrong with them. So at that point, then they will do anything to defend this fragile ego. So, so, she talks about a couple things. I think this one's really interesting. Whole object relations, which is the capacity to see oneself and others in a stable and integrated way and acknowledge that we all have good and bad qualities. And so someone with emotional immaturity really struggles with this whole object relations. You're either all good or you're all bad. And then object constancy is this ability to maintain a positive emotional connection to somebody that you like while you're hurt, angry, frustrated, or disappointed. So emotional immaturity is not being able to hold both man, I love this person, but I'm really struggling right now. And let's have a conversation, because we don't want that discomfort. And so, narcissists or emotionally immature people often seesaw back and forth between these. So when they feel good about you, or more accurately, you make them feel good about themselves, then everything is great. And you are special. And then all of a sudden you do something that they don't like. And it can be as simple as saying no, or oh, I don't think that's a good idea. And now all of a sudden, you have to be all bad and worthless. And so later, then you do something good again. And now all of a sudden they're back to seeing you as special. And so that cycles just, over and over again. And right. And
No, you're speaking my language. I've experienced what you're talking about. It's rough. It's enough to make you crazy.
Well, and can I jump right into normal or healthy ego versus pathological defensive narcissism?
Sure.
This is where I think things start to make sense from an emotionally immature standpoint. And back to this Eleanor Greenberg, I love the fact, and I changed what she's going to say, or so I want to give her credit for. She talks about, unfortunately, in the English language, the word narcissism has come to mean two entirely different things, depending on whether it's being used formally as a diagnosis, like narcissistic personality disorder, or the one that we no longer use as a synonym for positive self-regard. So this is where I go back to what Dr. Fife had said, and well, we're all a little narcissistic. And she said, and I get asked this too, isn't a little bit of narcissism healthy or normal? So here's the distinction. And this is where, on that Waking Up to Narcissism podcast, I was very intentional about the name, Waking Up to Narcissism. So it's either waking up to the narcissism in my relationship, or waking up to my own narcissistic traits and tendencies is the point. So a handful of episodes in, I waited, and then I feel like, and then I sprung it on everybody that narcissistic personality disorder is very small, but emotional immaturity, if we start with we're all emotionally immature until we're not, then now we get into this concept of normal, healthy ego. And so Eleanor Greenberg, then again, she called it normal, healthy narcissism, but I'm gonna replace the word narcissism with ego. And so then she says, this is a realistic sense of positive self-regard that is based on the person's actual accomplishments. It's relatively stable because the person is assimilated into their self-image, the success that came as a result of their actual hard work to overcome real life obstacles. So because it's based on real achievements, normal, healthy ego is relatively impervious to the minor slights and setbacks that we all experience as we go through life. Normal ego causes us to care about ourselves, do things that are in our real self-interest, and it's associated with genuine self-respect. So one can think of it as something that's inside of us. So I often talk about stepping into my healthy ego because as a therapist now that loves every bit of this, and I eat it and I sleep it and I drink it and I cannot wait to learn more about it, that then I feel very confident and I can stand in my healthy ego. And that's where we go back to how we started, how I can feel pretty confident in expressing things because I'm coming from a healthy ego. And I remember going to a training once where people did say that people like Jesus and Buddha and Gandhi, they had to have healthy ego to be able to put themselves in a position to change the world.
Right.
Now, if I go back to my computer days, now that's where, if I talk about what she said, the opposite of healthy ego is pathological defensive narcissism. So that is a defense against feelings of inferiority. So the person dons a mask of arrogant superiority in an attempt to convince the world that he or she is special. But inside, the person feels very insecure about his or her actual self-worth. So then this facade of superiority is so thin that it's like a helium balloon. So one small pinprick will deflate it. And this makes the person hypersensitive to minor slights that somebody with healthy ego wouldn't even notice. So instead, somebody with this type of defensive narcissism is easily wounded, frequently takes any form of disagreement as serious criticism, and is likely to lash out and devalue anybody who they think disagrees with them. So they're constantly on guard trying to protect their status. So she says pathological narcissism can be thought of as a protective armor that's on the outside of us. So right. So you can start to see that when I was in the computer industry, I was a pathological defensive narcissist because I needed people to think that I was so insecure, but I didn't know what I didn't know because I didn't know you could actually love a career and things as much as I did. So in that world, I had to make people think I was smart. And so in the process, I'm sure I said things that were ridiculous when people would ask me questions. And I would, because I would pretend, no, this is exactly the answer when I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one of the questions that came up, and I want to parlay it into something, another question after it. Somebody sent an email and said, how can one heal after divorcing from a long-term marriage to a narcissist?
Yeah. I think one of the hardest things is that, so when we talk about, we all come out of childhood and the way we get our validation is through parents, so we do need validation to have a sense of self. So most of the people that are honestly, that find themselves in these relationships with narcissists or emotionally immature people are people that came out of their own childhood, maybe not having the right, a secure attachment with a parent. And so they become this person that I can fix this person. I can love this person.
Kind of almost like a white knight in shining armor.
Yes. Right. Absolutely. And so then they're in a relationship with somebody that, unfortunately, that person who was the narcissist or incredibly emotionally immature, they did not have a sense of self. They didn't get any validation for the most part as they were growing up. So now they are desperately seeking validation, constantly. And this is where I talk about, when we are looking for external validation to make ourselves feel better. So when I look at when I was more emotionally immature, if I don't like the way I feel, then what I'm saying is I want my spouse to make me feel better. But if I don't know how that works, if I don't know what it would even feel like to feel whole or the sense of purpose or good about myself, then I often say there's a 90% chance that person is not going to say the right thing. And then I get to say, oh my gosh, you don't even care about me and I'm broken. So now I have to don this arrogant superiority to make sure that, I make sure that I matter.
And for the person that's dealing with that, it's hard because you're trying so hard, right? But everything you do is not quite right because they're not getting that external validation that they want. So then they say, well, this is what I need. You provide it for them.
Yes.
And they go, well, that wasn't exactly
it.
Right. That wasn't it. That's not how you did it. And I go, well, you do that, right? You go in there and you say that, and then that happens, and then you just keep trying, but it never gets there.
It never is. And so I say that I've got these 5 rules, and I'll get back and I will answer that question. The question, unfortunately, is when you get out of that relationship, you most all the time, the person then realizes they've lost their sense of self because they've been trying so desperately to meet the needs of someone whose needs cannot be met. So then, when I get somebody out of there, there's this concept of a trauma bond at times because they have looked for those times where there was a glimpse of hope here. And so now when I come back out of that, now I have to keep going back in and I can do this. I'm a hard worker. I'm a good person. I'm a nice person. I will find the way to get through to them again. But now understanding that narcissist there is no, oh, that's it. That's how I feel love, or that's how I feel connection. So the kind person, they might've got a glimpse of it for a second, but that is a moving target. And so now they're going to keep trying to find it.
Right.
So yeah.
Sorry. I want to parlay because I know you got a hard out in about 8 minutes. So I want to throw it out there, but I want to ask this because the trauma bond thing is something that you've talked about, and that's something I've heard a lot about. And it's really interesting to me because how do you know in those circumstances, what are the traits of a trauma bond versus just unconditional love. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's a great, and trauma bond. It's interesting. I mean, just even earlier today, I had a situation where somebody that it hit them for the first time that they said, okay, but I finally said this and did this. And we had this knockdown, drag out conversation. And they finally said, man, okay, you're right. Maybe I'm not looking at this right. And they said, and there I had it, but then within 2-3 hours later, then there's this concept called confabulation where, but that narcissist has to create a narrative that still backs up their worldview. So when the more they thought about it, it's like, well, yeah, maybe I could do it different, but it's because of the way you treat me. And so then that awareness is closed right back up. But now the nice person is saying, okay, but I can get that again. I can get there. So maybe we got to do another 2-hour knockdown drag out. Maybe I have to withdraw. Maybe I have to just kiss their butt for a few days, but we'll find it again. And so this person is burning all their emotional calories and what it feels like to be them and not addressing any of what their own sense of self or what makes them, an amazing person, a child of God, a unique individual, trying to figure out how to manage this other person's emotions to make that person feel loved. And so the more they do that, the more that trauma bond is just, I can find that good piece. And I'm willing to put up with, being gaslit and told I'm not enough and all these things because I desperately want to find that piece of love again. And so when I'm working with people, I've got these 5 rules of working with a narcissist. And I say, okay, self-care, raise your emotional baseline. Like you have to be ready for this, this challenge. Then I say, get your PhD in gaslighting. Start to understand that, no, I do have thoughts and feelings and I can be right. And it can be contrary to somebody else's. And so that's okay. So when I recognize gaslighting, and then I say, boy, the third one, get out of unproductive conversations, because if I'm being gaslit, it's going to go nowhere. And then my 4th one is set healthy boundaries. And then that might mean I have to leave the conversation. And then my 5th one, and this is the most important one, is realize that there's nothing that you will say or do that will cause them to have the aha moment or the epiphany. That is something they have to do. And that's where I feel like when I'm talking with people, they're continually saying, okay, but then I said this, and then I tried to tell them, well, what about this story? Or I use this analogy, or I remind them about this other time. And every one of those things is trying to convince that other person to have that aha moment. And the unfortunate part is what you're really doing is handing them your playbook. So when things get really emotionally raw, oftentimes that person now, the emotionally mature narcissist, knows what matters to you, and so now they'll use that against you. And that can be just devastating. It's really all this work I put in trying to help you. And now you're just blatantly disregarding that. And as a matter of fact, you're even using some of these things that I've desperately wanted against me. And so that can even further that trauma bond.
How long does it take? Have you seen in your experience?
Yeah.
We only got a few minutes. How long does it take for somebody to get through this process where they're seeing it, they start seeing it, they kind of start waking up to either their own or even a family member's narcissistic traits? How long does it get to the point where they can finally go through your 5 tools, and feel and kind of raise their own emotional
baseline? Yeah.
And one thing I've also noticed about this in just my own relationships, what I've noticed is that when you start doing that, when you start raising your own emotional baseline, start taking things for you, the narcissist you're dealing with, or the person with the narcissistic traits, really doesn't like that.
No, it's that, man, Josh, we could go for days. This is where, and I hate to say it, but I say, unfortunately, you're doing it right when when that person starts pushing more buttons, because, there's this concept of almost this marital collusion where, no, they need you to go back into that role of where they have that control, because all of a sudden what they fear the most is that loss of control. Because that's one of the scariest things, because now now we tap back into it. And it's unfortunate because now I'm telling the nice person that, hey, the better you do at this, the more buttons they're going to press, and they're going to tell you even the worst things, and the stakes are going to get higher, and they're going to do larger and larger behaviors. And that means you're doing it right, because they need to start doing anything to get you back into that position that you were in, because that feels safe to them, even though it feels emotionally dysregulated to the kind person, but that's the air they breathe. I mean, that's what they know. So then that's where I feel. So that's why I say when somebody's having a really deep emotional connection or conversation, and then all of a sudden now the fight is on, now all of a sudden that person will use that against you. And, and that's where they start, you're a horrible person. I'll put the kids against you. I'll tell everybody, I'll ruin you. And it's like, oh my gosh, this person's trying to hurt me. And unfortunately, people that are hurt people. And it's really hard. But you asked though, how long? Boy, this is not funny. It's very interesting, Josh, because there's talk often in the mental health world around this. So if I were to say to somebody, 3 to 5 years, I feel like people would go, "Are you kidding me?" I mean, that sounds horrible. So then often I say, man, it takes as long as it's going to take, and you're going to rule it out, and you're going to go back in, and you're going to try to make sense of things that don't make sense. And every time that you're doing that, there's this concept called implicit memory, or what it feels like to be you, is based on all of these little experiences that happen over and over again. So slowly but surely, I feel like the person is ruling out, no, I tried it again, and I know that I heard it on the podcast, or I know that Tony said this, but I really feel like this time, I feel like I can make some sense, to my spouse or whatever. And that's where my job. That's where I go from life coach to therapist. Life coach is saying those 5 things, the 5 rules, but then therapist is saying, and now when you go back in, then safe place to land. Like, let's talk about it, because you're normal, you're human. And because even when I developed those 5 rules, it was because I have this deal with a book publisher, and it was interesting because let me step back. I developed those 5 rules because everybody, when people get out of these narcissistic relationships, they often then write something, or they'll say, man, I should have just gotten out immediately. Yeah. Like, that did more damage. Right. But then the people that are in the relationships read the articles that say, stop reading this paragraph and leave. And 0% of people will do that because they don't know what they don't know yet. So their situation is going to be different. So even when I'm sitting there laying out these tools, even the person hearing me is like, yeah, but you don't know. I mean, because I saw this moment where she got sad, So I hear you, Tony, but mine's different. And that's where in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, how adorable. But on the outside, I'm saying, man, okay, no, I hear you. And so, but that's where when the person goes through it and comes back out, then we're reviewing the game film, and I call it a rule out. And so with this, where I was going with this was that, so then, that's the where I decided to go with this was, I will be the person that will say, okay, maybe you do have the unicorn. Maybe your narcissist can change. And so just follow these 5 steps. And then that's the way to really find out. But the reality is, when somebody follows those 5 steps, they often find their baseline so high that they realize, why am I doing this? Like, I'm of worth, Yeah. I am not living my best self for my kids, for to change the world, or whatever that looks like. And so this book project, it was funny. The publisher said, okay, go ahead and lay out all those things. And at the end go, surprise, this isn't a good relationship. And I was saying, oh, I can't do that. I got to start with hey, you're going to read that this is not a good relationship. And I'm going to say it's probably not, but let me walk you through the path, and then we'll see at the end, maybe it is. But then, when people get to the end, then typically that they discover that they were doing all the work.
They end up looking back and going, man, I should have ended that a long time ago.
Yeah, and then they write the blog article or the book and say, get out now, and
that's
then
so funny. I bet there's a lot of people who are going to be listening to this podcast and listen to your podcast who look at that and go, are you listening to are you in?
Oh man, I get that.
Have you got a video camera in my life? Because I bet there's a lot of people out there, like you said, narcissism, narcissistic traits, everybody's got them. Everybody's going to have a little bit of what you're talking about, but man, I bet there's a lot of people out there that you're hitting it right on the head as to what it's like to be dealing with that emotionally immature person or that narcissist.
Josh, I know that I knew of you before this, where you had your I think it was Saints and Cinema stuff. So I'll tell you, and I hope let's do this again. I mean, I know that I have this heart out, but I know I didn't even get to the questions, and there's so much more we could talk about. Sure. But the reason I say that is because if I were to tell somebody to go start somewhere on the Waking Up to Narcissism podcast, I have a trilogy. So there's my movie reference, and it's the Death by 1,000 Cuts, the trilogy. So there's 3 episodes, and that's where I feel like when people say you got a camera set up in my house, is when people are in these relationships. Often, if they were to express the things that they are struggling with in their marriage to people, it's a lot of little things. And so if you're telling that to somebody that has not experienced this type of a relationship, you're usually going to say, well, yeah, there's 2 sides to every story, or I'm sure it's not as big of a deal, or, well, it takes 2 to tango. But when it is a consistent pattern of a lack of taking ownership or accountability over and over, and even if we're trying to have a conversation, it's, well, yeah, but and there is no accountability, or when somebody really gets, called on the carpet, so to speak, then they emotionally dysregulate, or when that happens over and over, it is a death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah. Can I, real quick, I know you got a quick up, but can I ask you one last question that someone asked? And that you brought something up there where someone says, well, there's two sides to a story. And someone brought up a question of Switzerland friends.
Oh, yeah.
How they can be harmful during a traumatic time. And what should somebody who's doing that? Because I think everybody wants to do that, right? They hear a friend and they're like, boy, I'm friends with both of you. And I've even done that, right? I'm friends with both of you. I don't really want to get involved. So I'm sure there's two sides to your story, even though this sounds like a terrible traumatic event.
Yeah.
What would you say they should do instead in that circumstance?
Yeah, it's hard because when people so most of the time when somebody's in a narcissistic or emotionally immature relationship, they've been sequestered, they've been triangulated, they have not been encouraged to speak or communicate with others. So they felt like this is their journey. So when they finally start listening to podcasts or hearing other things, or they really do we all want to be heard. We all want to be heard and understood and validated. So what happens is people will often then, when they finally get the courage up, and they kind of emotionally dump on somebody, they're going to find out quickly if that person has ever been through something similar, then they're typically going to say, man, I hear you. And I've had that experience. So tell me more about it. But if they run into somebody that really hasn't, maybe has been in a more emotionally mature relationship, then that person is going to be more of the Switzerland friend and kind of play the middle. And so the unfortunate part is, boy, when you finally feel like I want to share and express myself, and you're met with that, but it is going to almost make people feel worse or less than, because now all of a sudden they feel like, I just opened up to this person, and now this person thinks I'm crazy, and I'm tired of feeling crazy. So the best case scenario is usually people will have a couple of those situations. And then I think I might have done an episode on this not too long ago, but it's all of a sudden starting to just really identify. I had a lady on my podcast a couple of weeks ago that wrote a book about getting out of a really horrific narcissistic relationship. And she said that identifying who are your builders and who are your destroyers, and the builders are the ones that you can start to slowly open up to, that are going to say, man, tell me more. And what's that like? And what can I do for you? Versus but there's two sides. And so the quicker that you can identify the Switzerland friends, then that doesn't mean they're horrible people. What it really means is they most likely haven't experienced anything similar. And you know what? That's good. I'm glad that they haven't. Right?
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting. Well, listen, I've taken you, I keep over your time, so I really appreciate you taking the time for it. But yes, let's have it. I didn't even get through half of the questions.
Okay, let's do it. Let's do it again next week, Josh. Let's keep it on a roll, okay? Because I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll set up another time to get you going on here, but really appreciate it. Your two podcasts that you have are the Virtual Couch, and you also
and Waking Up to Narcissism. Yeah,
both of them are excellent. You should go listen to them. Thanks for coming on, and we'll get you back on soon so we can keep going.
Let's do it. Okay. Thanks, Josh. Okay, we'll talk again soon. All right. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.